It is 11:30 on a Tuesday night in February 1926, and in a narrow cafeteria on 6th Avenue just south of Washington Square, a young man named Samuel Roth has just ordered his third cup of coffee. He is not here for the coffee. The coffee is terrible. He is here because at midnight, when the theatre crowd has gone home and the respectable working men have cleared out, this ordinary lunch counter will transform into something the police pretend not to see and the newspapers refuse to name. Samuel is 22. He works as a clerk at a haberdashery on 4th Avenue. He lives with his mother and two sisters in a walk-up on the Lower East Side. And every Tuesday and Thursday night, he walks 45 minutes across Manhattan to sit in this cafeteria and wait for the world to change at the stroke of 12. Tonight, we sit down next to him. I am Julian. This is Gay Timeline. If you find yourself settling in for this one, a like or a subscribe helps more than you might think, but only if you actually want more of these nights. And in the comments, let me know where in the world you are tonight and what time it is for you. It is always something to see who is out there listening at the same hour I am recording. For most of history, men like Samuel were alone. They ate at lunch counters where no one knew them. They loved in rooms no one would visit. They built entire social worlds in spaces the rest of the city walked past without noticing. Tonight, we keep them company. That is all sleep needs to be. A quiet act of refusing to let someone be forgotten. By the end of tonight, you will know the names of the cafeterias where gay New York was born, the men who ran them, and the exact moment the police decided these places had become too visible to ignore. You will know what it sounded like at 2 in the morning when 100 gay men felt safe enough to laugh out loud. And you will know what happened when the city tried to close the doors. Congratulations. You have just arrived in New York City in 1926. You are a young man who recently figured out you are not like other men. You have no word for it yet. The word homosexual exists, but it lives in medical textbooks and courtrooms, not in ordinary conversation. The word gay exists, but it means cheerful, carefree, a little scandalous in a heterosexual way. It will not mean what you are for another 20 years. So you have no name for yourself, but you have heard rumors. A friend of a friend mentioned a place. Let us see if you can find it. The city you're walking through is not the New York you know from films about flappers and jazz clubs. That New York exists, but it costs money. The speakeasies where women wear beaded dresses and men wear tuxedos charge $1 at the door and $2 for a whiskey. You make $18 a week. You cannot afford that New York. The New York you can afford smells like coal smoke and wet wool, and the particular funk of 100,000 men wearing the same wool suit every day for a year. The streets south of 14th Street are narrow. The buildings lean toward each other. Laundry hangs across the gaps between tenements like flags of surrender. The sidewalks are crowded even at midnight because half the neighborhood works night shifts, and the other half cannot sleep in apartments that house 8 people in 3 rooms. You are walking south on 6th Avenue. The elevated train roars overhead every 7 minutes, shaking the sidewalk and drowning out all conversation. When the train passes, the silence feels alien. Your hands are in your coat pockets because it is February and you do not own gloves. Your breath makes small clouds in front of your face. You are nervous. You have been nervous for 3 weeks since your friend told you about this place. Your friend is named Jake. He works with you at the hat shop. He is 25, which feels impossibly old and sophisticated to you at 22. 3 weeks ago, after the shop closed, Jake asked if you wanted to get a coffee. You said yes. You went to a lunch counter on 8th Street. You talked about nothing important for 20 minutes. Then Jake said, very quietly, "I know a place where men like us go." You did not ask what he meant by men like us. You knew. Jake told you the place was called Stewart's. He said it was just a cafeteria, ordinary during the day, different at night. He said if you went after midnight, you would understand. He said to order coffee and sit near the back. He said not to stare. He said the cops knew about it, but did not care as long as everyone was careful. He said the word careful like it was the most important word in the language. You asked if he would go with you. He said no. He said he had a fellow, and they did not go to the cafeterias anymore. They had a room now, a place of their own. He said the cafeterias were for when you were still looking. His voice when he said it was not unkind. It was just true. So you have come alone. You reach the corner of 6th Avenue and Waverly Place and you stop. Across the street is a cafeteria with a blue and white awning. The sign says Stewart's in tall block letters. The windows are steamed from the inside. Through the condensation you can see shapes moving. It looks completely ordinary. It looks like every other cheap lunch counter in Manhattan. You almost turn around and go home, but you do not. You cross the street. You push open the door. A small bell chimes. The warm air inside smells like coffee and grilled onions and damp overcoats. You join the line at the counter. The woman behind the register does not look at you. You order coffee. 10 cents. You pay. You take the heavy white mug and you walk toward the back of the room. There are about 30 men inside. Most of them are sitting alone at small tables. A few sit in pairs. They are all wearing dark suits and overcoats. They all look tired. They all look ordinary. You feel a wave of crushing disappointment. This is just a cafeteria. Jake was wrong, or he was playing a trick on you, or you misunderstood. You sit down at a table near the back wall. You wrap your hands around the coffee mug for warmth. You look at the clock on the wall. It is 11:40, and then you wait. At 11:55, two men walk in together. They are both young, maybe 19 or 20. One of them has dark curly hair and a bright laugh that carries across the room. The other is blonde and quiet. They order coffee and sit at a table near the window. The dark-haired one says something and the blonde one smiles. It is the kind of smile you have never seen one man give another in public. At midnight, the door opens again and 4 men enter. They are older, maybe 30 or 35. They are loud. One of them calls out to the woman behind the counter by name. Estelle, he says, your coffee is still terrible. She tells him to go to hell. He blows her a kiss. They sit at a center table and deal out a deck of cards. At 12:15, a man in a purple scarf walks in. The scarf is silk. It is the most beautiful thing you have seen all week. He orders tea, not coffee. He sits alone near the radiator and pulls out a book. He does not look at anyone. But the way he sits, the way he crosses his legs, the way he holds the book, all of it is a language you are just beginning to learn. By 12:30, the cafeteria is full. 40 men, maybe 50. The woman behind the counter has been replaced by a man with a mustache who looks bored. Most of the men are talking now. Some are still alone, but the alone ones are watching. You realize you are watching too. You realize everyone is watching everyone else in a way that would be rude. Anywhere else but here feels like breathing. At 12:40, a man sits down across from you. He does not ask if the seat is taken. He just sits. He is about your age, thin, with light brown hair and very green eyes. He puts his coffee on the table. He looks at you. He says, "First time." You nod. He smiles. It is a kind smile. He says, "You will get used to it." His name is Peter. You will learn this later. For now, you just look at him and feel your heart beat so hard you think he must hear it. He asks where you are from. You tell him the Lower East Side. He says he is from Brooklyn. He works at a printing plant in Greenpoint. He comes here twice a week. He asks if you want to take a walk. You do. You leave your coffee half finished. You follow him out into the cold. The elevated train roars past overhead, and for 7 seconds you cannot hear anything, and you are grateful because you do not know what to say. When the train passes, Peter says, "There is a park 2 blocks south. It is small. No one bothers you there at night." His voice is calm, steady. He has done this before. You walk together in silence. The park is just a square of fenced grass with 3 benches and a leafless tree. Peter sits on the center bench. You sit next to him. He asks if you have ever done this before. You shake your head. He nods. He says, It gets easier. You ask, what gets easier? He says, all of it. Knowing what you are, finding the places, finding people who understand. You ask if he has someone. He says not right now. He says he did, for a while, but it ended. He does not say why. You do not ask. He asks if you want to meet here again next week. You say yes before he finishes the sentence. He smiles. He says, good. Then he stands up. He says he has to get home before the trains stop running. He says he will see you next Tuesday at Stewart's. Midnight. He says, do not be late. You watch him walk away. You sit on the bench alone for 20 minutes. The cold soaks through your coat, but you do not care. You feel like you have been holding your breath for 2 years, and you finally let it out. When you walk back past Stewart's, the lights are still on, and the windows are still full of men. That story is a composite, but every detail in it is documented. The historian George Chauncey spent years in the archives of New York City mapping the gay world of the early 20th century, and what he found were the cafeterias, dozens of them, ordinary lunch counters by day, gay social centers by night. They were not hidden, they were not secret, they were simply invisible to anyone who was not looking. Chauncey found police reports, vice squad surveillance logs, court transcripts, and health department inspection records. He found letters and diaries from men who went to these places. He found newspaper articles that mentioned the cafeterias in passing, always with vague language. A place frequented by inverts, a known haunt of degenerates. The papers never named them directly, but the gay men of New York did not need the papers. They had word of mouth, and word of mouth built an entire geography. Stewart's Cafeteria at 103 6th Avenue near Waverly Place. The original, the most famous, open 24 hours. The back tables were for the young men still figuring it out. The front tables near the windows were for the older men who had stopped caring who saw. The Life Cafeteria at 961 6th Avenue near 53rd Street. Also open all night. Louder than Stewart's, more theatrical. This was where the drag performers went after their shows in the Village. The owner knew. Everyone knew. No one said it out loud. Clark's on 42nd Street just east of Times Square, smaller, grittier. This was where the hustlers worked. Young men in tight trousers leaning against the back wall, waiting. The Vice Squad raided Clark's 4 times in 1927 alone. It reopened every time. Child's Restaurant at 5th Avenue and 59th Street. Not technically a cafeteria, more upscale. But after midnight the crowd changed. Men in tailored suits. Men who worked in offices and lived in respectable apartments. Men who had more to lose. They sat in the back booths and kept their voices low. The waiters knew not to rush them. The Automat on 14th Street. During lunch, it was secretaries and shopgirls putting nickels in slots for sandwiches. After midnight, it was gay men doing exactly the same thing, but the air felt different. The historian Chad Heap found a diary entry from 1928 that described the 14th Street Automat as a place where you could sit with a cup of coffee for 2 hours and watch the entire world walk by. By the world, the writer meant the gay world, the only world that mattered to him. These places were not clubs. They did not serve alcohol. You could not dance in them. They were just cafeterias, cheap food, cheap coffee, open all night. And that was exactly why they worked. The speakeasies were dangerous. That is the first thing to understand. The glamorous jazz-age speakeasy you see in movies, where everyone is witty and drunk and beautiful, that place existed. But it was not safe for gay men. The speakeasies were run by criminals. The alcohol was illegal. The cops could raid them any time. And when the cops raided a speakeasy, everyone inside was arrested. Everyone. If you were a man found in a raid with another man, the newspapers printed your name and address. Your employer found out. Your family found out. You lost everything. The cafeterias were legal. They sold legal food and legal coffee. The cops could walk in any time and all they would see was men drinking coffee. Yes, the cops knew what the cafeterias really were. But as long as no one was breaking the law, there was nothing to arrest. As long as the men stayed quiet and did not draw attention, the cops looked the other way. This was the unspoken agreement. You could exist, but you could not be loud. You could gather, but you could not touch. You could look at each other, but you could not kiss. The moment you crossed the line into visible law-breaking, the agreement was void. The cafeterias taught gay men how to be invisible in plain sight, how to communicate without words, how to build an entire social world in the gaps between what was legal and what was possible. A man sitting alone at a table, reading a newspaper, glancing up every 30 seconds. That glance was a signal. The newspaper was a prop. He was not reading. He was hunting. Two men sitting across from each other, both facing the door, never quite making eye contact. They were not friends. They were strangers negotiating. The negotiation was silent. One man would eventually stand and leave. The other would wait 60 seconds, then follow. They would meet 2 blocks away. The cafeteria was just the introduction. A man who sat at the same table every night at the same time. Regulars knew he was safe to approach. Newcomers learned by watching who else approached him. The clothes were signals too. A red necktie, a green pocket square, a pinky ring, a certain style of hat tilted just so. The historian Michael Bronsky found a 1929 guidebook, privately printed and passed hand to hand among gay men in New York, that listed the codes. The guidebook is lost now, but fragments were quoted in a court case in 1931. A red tie meant you were looking. A green handkerchief meant you had a private room. A particular type of hat meant you were willing to pay. The guidebook was called The Social Register. It was 20 pages long. It listed cafeterias, parks, bathrooms, piers and theatres where gay men gathered. It listed the safe times and the dangerous times. It listed which cops took bribes and which cops were true believers who would arrest you even if it meant paperwork. It was updated every 6 months. No one knows who wrote it. It was unsigned. But someone in New York in the 1920s cared enough about gay men staying safe that they risked prison to print and distribute a guide. That anonymous writer probably went to Stewart's. Samuel Roth was real. He was not a clerk at a hat shop. He was a bookstore owner and a publisher. And in 1931, he was arrested for obscenity, not for homosexuality, because he published an unauthorized edition of James Joyce's Ulysses. But in his private papers, donated to the New York Public Library decades after his death, there are receipts from Stewart's cafeteria dated 1925 through 1928. Dozens of them, all for coffee, purchased between midnight and 3 in the morning. Sometimes 2 coffees on the same receipt. Samuel was married, he had children, and he also went to Stewart's after midnight and bought coffee for himself and for men whose names he never wrote down. The receipts do not tell us what happened after the coffee. But the fact that he kept the receipts, that he saved them in a box with his important papers, suggests the nights mattered to him. Suggests he wanted someone, someday, to know he had been there. We know he was there, and we know he was not alone. The writer Parker Tyler went to Stewart's in 1929. He wrote about it decades later in his memoir, published in 1972 when he was 70 years old and no longer cared what anyone thought. He described the cafeteria as a place that felt like church and theatre and home all at once. He said the men there were more honest than any men he met anywhere else in the city, because they had already admitted the most dangerous truth about themselves just by walking in the door. Tyler wrote that at Stewart's you could tell who was new and who was old by how they held their coffee cups. The new men gripped the cups with both hands, like they were praying. The old men held the cups loosely, one-handed, while they scanned the room. The new men looked terrified. The old men looked bored. But both groups kept coming back. The poet Hart Crane went to the Life Cafeteria on 6th Avenue in 1924 and met a sailor named Emile. They spent 3 days together. When the sailor left to rejoin his ship, Crane went back to the cafeteria every night for 2 weeks, hoping to see him again. He never did, but he kept going anyway. In a letter to a friend, He described the life as a place where hope was cheap and company was cheaper, and both were enough to keep you alive. The novelist Charles Henry Ford met the artist Pavel Chilichu at Stewart's in 1930. They were together for 10 years. Chilichu's paintings hung in the Museum of Modern Art. Ford's novels were reviewed in the New York Times. But they met over bad coffee in a cafeteria at 1 in the morning because that was where men like them could meet. These men were artists, writers, poets, men whose names survived because they were famous. But for every famous man who went to the cafeterias, there were 100 ordinary men who left no record. Shop clerks and delivery drivers and factory workers and office boys. Men who never wrote memoirs or saved receipts or painted paintings. Men whose names are lost, but we know they were there. Because the cafeterias were full. On a busy night, Stewart's held 80 men. The fire code said the maximum occupancy was 60. The fire marshal was paid $20 a month to ignore the count. We know this because in 1928, a new fire marshal took over the district and refused the payment. He cited Stewart's for overcrowding. The owner, a man named Louis Stewart, fought the citation. The case went to a hearing. The transcript survives. The fire marshal testified that on 3 separate nights in January 1928, he had counted more than 70 men in the cafeteria after midnight. He said the crowd was a fire hazard. He said the men were packed so tightly that if a fire broke out, people would die in the crush. Louis Stewart's lawyer asked why the fire marshal had visited after midnight instead of during normal business hours. The fire marshal said he had received complaints from neighbors about noise. The lawyer asked what kind of noise. The fire marshal said laughter, singing, loud conversation. The lawyer asked if laughter was illegal. The fire marshal said no, but disturbing the peace was. The lawyer asked if the fire marshal had ever arrested anyone at Stewart's for disturbing the peace. The fire marshal said no. The lawyer asked why not. The fire marshal said it had not seemed necessary. The lawyer asked if the fire marshal knew what kind of men frequented Stewart's after midnight. The fire marshal said he had his suspicions. The lawyer asked if suspicion was grounds for a citation. The fire marshal said no. The citation was for overcrowding. The judge ruled in favor of Louis Stewart. The fire marshal was ordered to stop harassing the business. The cafe stayed open. That hearing transcript is 30 pages long. Nowhere in it does anyone use the word homosexual. Nowhere does anyone directly state what everyone in the room knew. The lawyer danced around it. The fire marshal danced around it. The judge danced around it. And Louis Stewart won because nobody was willing to say the truth out loud in a courtroom. But the truth was in the transcript anyway, hidden in the language, complaints about noise after midnight, 70 men in a cafeteria at 1 in the morning, suspicions. The whole gay world of 1920s New York was built in that gap between what people knew and what they were willing to say. Louis Stewart knew exactly what his cafeteria was. He never said so in court, but his actions spoke. He kept the place open 24 hours, even though the profit margin on late-night coffee was nearly zero. He never called the cops when fights broke out, and fights did break out, because calling the cops meant the cops would start paying closer attention. He hired women to work the late shift at the counter, because women were less likely to be accused of soliciting the male customers. He kept the lights bright and the tables clean and the coffee hot. He built a place where men could sit in warmth and safety for the price of a dime. He died in 1947. His obituary in the New York Times did not mention that his cafeteria had been the social center of gay New York for over 20 years. It said he was a businessman and a civic leader. It said he was survived by his wife and 3 daughters. It said he was a member of the Rotary Club. But the men who went to Stewart's knew, and some of them lived long enough to tell the story to historians 50 years later. George Chauncey interviewed 12 men in the 1980s who had gone to the cafeterias in the 1920s. Most of them were in their 70s and 80s by then. Some of them cried during the interviews, not from sadness, from relief. Relief that someone was finally asking. Relief that someone cared. Relief that the places they had loved were going to be remembered. One man, who asked to remain anonymous, told Chauncey that Stewart's had saved his life. He said he had been planning to kill himself in the winter of 1927. He was 19. He worked in a garment factory. He lived with his parents and 4 siblings. He had no privacy, no money, no future he could imagine. He thought he was the only person in the world who felt the way he felt. And then a co-worker mentioned the cafeteria. Just in passing. Just a comment about a place where certain men went. The man went, and he found a room full of people like him. He said it was like learning he was not insane. He said it was like discovering he was human. He kept going to Stewart's every week for 4 years. He met his first boyfriend there. He met his friends there. He learned how to dress, how to talk, how to navigate the world as a gay man in a city that barely acknowledged gay men existed. And then in 1931, the police raided Stewart's and arrested 43 men for disorderly conduct. He was not there that night. He had stayed home because he had a cold. His boyfriend was there. His boyfriend was arrested, charged, and named in the newspaper. His boyfriend lost his job. His boyfriend's family disowned him. His boyfriend left the city, and the man never saw him again. The man told Chauncey this story in 1985, 54 years later. He said he still thought about his boyfriend every day. He said he never learned what happened to him. He said he hoped he was still alive somewhere. He said he hoped he had been happy. The interview transcript ends there. Chauncey noted that the man was crying and asked if he wanted to stop. The man said no. He said he wanted someone to know. He said the cafeterias mattered. He said the men who went there mattered. He said it was important that someone write it down, so Chauncey wrote it down. And now you know. The 1931 raid on Stewart's happened on a Saturday night in March. It was warm for March. Spring was arriving early. The windows of the cafeteria were open. You could hear the laughter from the street. A vice squad officer named Thomas Daly had been watching Stewart's for 3 weeks. He had been ordered to watch it by his captain, who had been ordered to watch it by someone higher up, who had been pressured by a neighborhood improvement association that wanted the degenerates removed. The chain of command was long, and the motivation was always the same. Someone respectable had decided the neighborhood was declining. Someone respectable wanted it cleaned up. Officer Daly filed reports. He noted the number of men entering after midnight. He noted that many of them left in pairs. He noted their clothing, their mannerisms, their apparent ages. He noted that no illegal activity was occurring inside the cafeteria itself. But he also noted, and this was the key phrase, that the cafeteria appeared to be serving as a meeting place for the purpose of later illicit encounters. Appeared to be. Purpose of. Later. The language was vague because it had to be. You could not arrest someone for what they might do later, but you could arrest them for disorderly conduct if you stretched the definition far enough. And in 1931, disorderly conduct meant whatever the police wanted it to mean. The raid was planned for midnight. 20 officers. They surrounded the building. They walked in through both doors at once. They announced that everyone inside was under arrest. They did not say why. They did not need to. 43 men were arrested. They were walked out in groups of 5, hands behind their backs, no handcuffs because there were not enough handcuffs. The neighbors watched from their windows. A journalist from the Herald Tribune happened to be walking past. He took notes. His article ran 2 days later on page 17. The headline said, "Deviants arrested in village cafeteria." The article listed the names and addresses of all 43 men. 17 of them lost their jobs within a week. 9 of them were evicted from their apartments. 2 of them left the city and were never heard from again. One of them, a man named David Klein, who worked as a clerk at a law firm, jumped in front of a subway train on the Lexington Avenue line 6 days after his name appeared in the paper. He was 24 years old. The Herald Tribune did not connect his death to the raid. His obituary said he died in a tragic accident. Louis Stewart, the owner, was not arrested. The cafeteria was not closed. The charges against the 43 men were eventually dropped because the prosecutor could not prove they had actually done anything illegal. But the damage was done. For 3 months after the raid, Stewart's was nearly empty at night. The men were afraid. They went to other cafeterias. They scattered. The community that had been built over 6 years dissolved in one night. By the summer of 1931, Stewart's was filling up again, slowly, carefully. The men came back because they had nowhere else to go, but it was never quite the same. There was a new wariness, a new silence. The laughter was quieter. The groups were smaller. Everyone sat facing the door. Officer Thomas Daly was promoted to sergeant 3 months after the raid. His career file, preserved in the NYPD archives, lists the raid as a successful operation that cleaned up a known vice location. There is no mention of the man who died. There is no mention of the lives destroyed. Success was measured in arrests, not in human cost. The cafeterias were not the only places. There were the piers, the parks, the bathrooms in certain subway stations and department stores, the balconies of certain movie theaters, the Turkish baths on the Lower East Side. Every gay man in New York knew the geography. You learned it the way you learned which streets were safe to walk at night and which were not. You learned it from other men, whispered over coffee, passed along in coded language. But the cafeterias were different because they were public and continuous. A pier was dangerous and temporary. You went there in the dark. You did what you needed to do. You left. A park was seasonal. A bathroom was furtive and fast. The cafeterias were warm. You could stay for hours. You could talk. You could meet the same people week after week and build something that almost resembled normal social life. The writer Samuel Stewart, who later became famous under the name Phil Sparrow, went to the Life Cafeteria in 1933. He was 23. He had just moved to New York from Ohio. He knew no one. He had read about the cafeterias in a letter from a friend, a single sentence buried in gossip. Life on 6th Ave after midnight if you need company. Stewart went. He ordered coffee and sat near the back. He watched. A man in a grey suit sat down across from him and said, "You look lost." Stewart said he was new in town. The man said, "You will figure it out." Then he stood up and left. Stewart sat there for another hour. No one else spoke to him, but the fact that someone had spoken at all felt like a door opening. He went back the next week, and the next. By the 4th week, he recognized faces. A tall man with red hair who always sat by the window. A short man with glasses who read the same book every night. A very young man, maybe 18, who sat alone and looked terrified and never ordered anything. Stewart wondered if he should say something to the young man. He did not. He was still too new himself, still too uncertain. The 5th week, the young man was gone. Stewart never saw him again. He wondered about that for years. Wondered if the young man had found what he was looking for. Wondered if he had given up. Wondered if something bad had happened. The cafeterias were full of men you saw once and never again. Some of them found love and left. Some of them got arrested. Some of them just stopped coming. You never knew which. Stewart met a man named Jack at the Life in October 1933. Jack was 30, a schoolteacher, careful and kind. They had coffee together 3 times before Jack invited Stewart to his apartment. The apartment was a single room on 10th Street with a hot plate and a shared bathroom down the hall. They spent the night together. In the morning, Jack made eggs on the hot plate, and they ate breakfast sitting on the bed because there was no table. Stewart asked if they could see each other again. Jack said yes. They saw each other twice a week for 4 months. They never called it a relationship. They never used the word love. But Stewart described it in his diary as the first time he felt like he was living his actual life instead of performing someone else's. In February 1934, Jack told Stewart he was moving to California. He had been offered a job at a private school in Pasadena. Better pay, better weather, a fresh start. He did not ask Stewart to come with him. Stewart did not ask to come. They both understood that what they had was temporary. Everything was temporary when you were gay in 1934. Jack left in March. Stewart went back to the Life Cafeteria. He sat at the same table where he had first seen Jack. A different man sat down across from him and said, "You look lost." Stewart said he was fine. The man said, "If you say so," and left. Stewart finished his coffee. He went home. He cried for the first time in years. Then he went to sleep. The next week, He went back to the life and started again. Years later, in 1977, Stewart published a memoir called Chapters from an Autobiography. He wrote about Jack. He wrote about the life cafeteria. He wrote that the cafeterias were where he learned that being gay was not a sickness or a sin, but simply a fact. He wrote that the men he met there taught him how to survive. He said he owed them everything. Most of them were dead by the time he wrote that. He never learned their last names. The women had their own places. This needs to be said clearly because the history of gay New York is often told as if only men existed. The women were there too. They had fewer spaces because women in the 1920s had less freedom of movement, less money, less access to public space after dark. But they found their ways. There was a cafeteria on 8th Street near 5th Avenue called the Black Rabbit. Officially, it was just a cafeteria. Unofficially, after 10 p.m., it became a lesbian social club. The women who went there called it the Rabbit. They were factory workers, seamstresses, typists, telephone operators. A few were artists or writers, but most were working class. They wore trousers when they could get away with it. They wore men's shirts under their coats. They cut their hair short and slicked it back with pomade. The owner of the Black Rabbit was a woman named Margaret Harrigan. She was 50 years old in 1927. She had owned the cafeteria for 12 years. She lived above the shop with another woman named Ruth. Everyone knew they were together. No one said it directly. Margaret ran the cafeteria with absolute authority. She did not allow drunkenness. She did not allow fighting. She did not allow men to harass her customers. The one time a man came in and started shouting insults at a table of women, Margaret herself walked over and hit him in the face with a cast-iron skillet. He left. He did not come back. The police raided the Black Rabbit once, in 1929. They arrested 8 women for disorderly conduct. The charges were dropped when Margaret's lawyer argued that the women had been sitting quietly drinking coffee and the police had no grounds for arrest. The judge agreed. The women were released. But Margaret closed the cafeteria 2 months later anyway. She told a reporter that she was retiring. She did not say why. But the raid had frightened away most of her late-night customers, and without them, the business was not profitable. Margaret and Ruth moved to Connecticut. They bought a small house near the coast. They lived there together for 23 years. When Margaret died in 1952, the obituary in the local paper said she was survived by her longtime companion Ruth. The word companion, doing the work that words like partner and wife were not allowed to do. A woman named Mabel Hampton went to the Black Rabbit in 1925. She was a dancer. She performed in small clubs in Harlem. She was 23 and bold and beautiful. She met a woman named Lillian at the Rabbit. Lillian was a seamstress. She was quiet where Mabel was loud. They were together for 6 months. Then Lillian got sick. Tuberculosis. She died in a city hospital in January 1926. Mabel was not allowed to visit her because she was not family. Mabel lived until 1989. She was interviewed by the Lesbian History Archives in 1984. She talked about the Black Rabbit. She said it was the first place she ever felt safe being herself. She said the women there were her family. She said when Lillian died, the women from the Rabbit came to her apartment and sat with her. They brought food. They stayed for 3 days. They made sure she was not alone. Mabel said Margaret Harrigan saved lives by keeping that cafeteria open. She said it was not dramatic. It was just coffee and a warm room and the knowledge that you were not the only one. But for women like her, that knowledge was the difference between living and not living. The Lesbian History Archives has 43 hours of interviews with Mabel Hampton. She talked about the rent parties in Harlem, the drag balls, the clubs, the speakeasies. But she always came back to the Black Rabbit. She said it was the place that taught her she was allowed to exist. By 1935, there were at least 20 cafeterias in Manhattan that functioned as gay gathering places after dark. The number comes from a police department internal memo, discovered by historians in the 1990s. The memo was written by a deputy inspector named Harold Klein. It was marked confidential. It was never meant to be public. Inspector Klein had been ordered to assess the scope of what the memo called the invert problem in Manhattan. He spent 6 months observing. He assigned plainclothes officers to stake out known locations. He compiled lists. The memo is 18 pages long. It lists cafeterias, bars, parks, bathhouses, hotels, and rooming houses. It estimates that approximately 15,000 men in Manhattan were what the memo calls active homosexuals. It estimates another 5,000 occasional participants, 20,000 men, in a city of 7 million. The number sounds small until you remember that these were only the men visible enough to be counted. Only the men who went to the known places. The men who stayed hidden, who never risked the cafeterias or the parks, who lived their entire lives in secret. They were not counted. The real number was certainly higher. Inspector Klein's memo recommended increased surveillance but not mass arrests. He wrote that arresting homosexuals was largely ineffective because the courts rarely convicted and the newspapers rarely covered the stories unless the men involved were prominent. He wrote that the best strategy was containment. Let them gather in known locations, monitor those locations, arrest selectively, targeting the most visible or the most reckless. Keep the problem manageable. The memo was stamped approved. That became the unofficial policy. The cafeterias were allowed to exist as long as they stayed quiet. The moment they became too visible, too loud, too confident, the police would remind them of the line. That line moved constantly. What was tolerated in 1927 was raided in 1931. What was raided in 1931 was tolerated again in 1933. The men who went to the cafeterias learned to read the shifts. When there were more cops on the street, you stayed home. When a new administration came in promising to clean up vice, you scattered for a few months. When the heat died down, you came back. It was exhausting. It required constant vigilance. But it was still better than complete isolation. The cafeterias offered something no amount of fear could erase. They offered proof that you were not alone. A man named Franklin Street went to Charles' restaurant on 5th Avenue in 1936. He was 40 years old. He was a lawyer. He worked at a firm on Wall Street. He made good money. He lived in a respectable apartment on the Upper East Side. He was married. He had 2 children. And twice a month, he told his wife he was working late, and he took the subway downtown to Childs and sat in the back booth and met men. Franklin's story survives because he kept a diary. The diary was found after his death in 1962 by his daughter, who donated it to Columbia University in 1984 with the request that it not be opened until 2010. It was opened. Historians read it, and now we know. Franklin wrote in meticulous detail. He recorded the dates of his visits to Childs. He recorded the names of the men he met, when he learned them. Most of the time he did not learn their names. He described them instead. The tall one with the scar, the boy who worked at Macy's, the redhead who never smiled. He wrote about the guilt, pages and pages about the guilt. He loved his wife. He wrote that over and over. He loved his children. He was a good father. He provided for them. He was faithful to his wife in every way except this one. But this one way was not a small thing. It was the center of him. He wrote that he felt split in half. The man who went to work and came home and played with his children and kissed his wife goodnight. And the man who sat in the back booth at Childs and felt his whole body come alive when another man looked at him. He wrote that he thought about suicide often. But he also wrote that the nights at Childs kept him alive. He wrote that the men he met there, even the ones whose names he never learned, understood him in a way his wife never could. He wrote that he was lonely in his marriage and less lonely in a cafeteria full of strangers. In 1940, Franklin met a man named Paul at Childs. Paul was 28, an accountant, also married. They started meeting regularly, every other week, always at Childs, always in the same booth. They talked. Sometimes they left together and walked to a hotel on 34th Street that rented rooms by the hour. Sometimes they just talked and then went home. This went on for 3 years. In his diary, Franklin called Paul the love of his life. He never told Paul that. He never used the word love out loud, but he wrote it in the diary 47 times across 3 years. In 1943, Paul stopped coming to Childs. Franklin went every week for 2 months. Paul never appeared. Franklin did not know Paul's last name, did not know where he lived or worked, had no way to find him. He wrote in his diary that losing Paul was worse than any pain he had ever known. He wrote that he felt like he was grieving a death, but had no body to bury, no funeral to attend, no one to tell. He kept going to Childs for another year. He met other men. He wrote about them, but he also wrote that none of them were Paul. In 1944, he stopped going. He wrote that he was getting too old, too tired, too afraid of being caught. He wrote that he would live the rest of his life as the man his family thought he was. He wrote that it felt like dying. Franklin died in 1962 of a heart attack. He was 66. His obituary in the Times praised his legal work and his dedication to his family. His wife survived him by 12 years. His children never knew about the diary until after their mother died. His daughter, reading it for the first time, wrote a note that was included in the Columbia archive. The note says, "I wish he had known he could have told us. I wish he had known we would have loved him anyway, but he did not know that. Men like Franklin never knew that." They lived in a world that gave them 2 choices: hide completely or risk everything. The cafeterias were the thin space between those choices, a place where you could be yourself for 2 hours and then go back to hiding. It was not freedom, but it was something. The Light Cafeteria on 14th Street near 6th Avenue opened in 1929. It was larger than Stewart's, brighter. The owner was a man named Joseph Katz. He was not gay. He was simply a businessman who noticed that a certain demographic was underserved. Gay men had money to spend and nowhere to spend it safely. Joseph provided a service. He made a profit. He was honest about it, in his way. In a 1932 interview with a trade magazine about the restaurant industry, he was asked about his customer base. He said his cafeteria served working men who kept irregular hours. He said the late-night crowd was reliable. He said they stayed longer than the daytime customers and therefore bought more coffee. He did not say the words gay or homosexual. He did not need to. The Light became the largest gay cafeteria in the city. On a Saturday night, it could hold 120 men. It had a piano in the corner. No one was officially allowed to play it, but sometimes, late at night, someone would sit down and play anyway. The staff never stopped them. The other customers would gather around. Someone would start singing, quietly at first, then louder. The historian Stephen Merritt, writing in the 1990s, interviewed a man named Leonard Fisher, who went to the Light in 1933. Leonard was 91 when he was interviewed. He remembered the singing. He said it was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. 100 men singing together, badly, joyfully, without fear, at 2 a.m. in a cafeteria on 14th Street. He said it felt like church. Leonard said the police broke it up eventually. They did not arrest anyone. They just walked in and told everyone to leave. The crowd dispersed. But the next week they came back, and someone played the piano again, and they sang again. Leonard said it became a pattern. The police would shut it down. The crowd would come back. It was a kind of negotiation. The police asserted authority. The men asserted existence. Neither side won. Neither side gave up. The Light stayed open until 1965. By then the neighborhood had changed. The gay bars of the West Village had opened, and the cafeterias felt old-fashioned. The younger men wanted dancing and alcohol, not coffee and singing. The Light's late-night crowd dwindled. Joseph Katz sold the business. It became a diner, then a Starbucks, Now it is a bank. But for 36 years, it was a place where gay men could sit together and be seen. That mattered. It still matters. The cafeterias had rules, unwritten rules that everyone learned by watching. You did not sit at a table where men were already deep in conversation unless you were invited. You did not stare too long. You did not touch in ways that could be seen from the street. You did not raise your voice. You did not draw attention. And you always watched the door. A man named Vincent Livelli went to Stewart's in 1927. He was 19. He worked delivering groceries in Little Italy. His family was from Naples. His father expected him to marry a nice Italian girl and take over the grocery business. Vincent knew he would never do either of those things, but he did not know what he would do instead. He went to Stewart's on a Thursday night in June. It was hot, the kind of New York heat that makes the air feel solid. The cafeteria was less crowded than usual because of the weather, maybe 30 men inside. Vincent ordered iced coffee, which cost 15 cents instead of 10. He sat near the back and tried to look like he belonged there. A man sitting 2 tables away caught his eye. The man was older, maybe 35, with dark hair going grey at the temples. He was reading a newspaper. He glanced up. He looked at Vincent for exactly 3 seconds. Then he looked back at his paper. Then he stood up, folded the paper under his arm, and walked out. Vincent did not know if he was supposed to follow. He sat there for 5 minutes, uncertain. Then he stood up and walked outside. The man was standing on the corner of Waverly Place, smoking a cigarette. He did not look at Vincent. He just started walking south. Vincent followed. They walked 3 blocks in silence. Then the man turned into a doorway. It was a rooming house. The man climbed the stairs. Vincent followed. The room was on the 3rd floor. Small. A bed, a chair, a window that looked out onto a brick wall. The man closed the door. He said, "First time?" Vincent nodded. The man said, "It is all right. You will be fine." His name was Giuliano. He was a tailor. He had a shop on Mulberry Street. He had been coming to Stewart's for 8 years. He told Vincent this while they sat on the edge of the bed, not touching yet, just talking. He said he had been married once. His wife had died in childbirth. The baby died too. That was 12 years ago. He had not tried to marry again. People assumed he was still grieving. He let them assume. He asked Vincent if he had ever been with a man before. Vincent said no. Giuliano said, "Do you want to be?" Vincent said yes. What happened next? Vincent described in a letter he wrote 40 years later to a friend. The letter is part of the One Archives in Los Angeles. Vincent wrote that Giuliano was kind, patient, that he made Vincent feel safe. That afterward they lay in the narrow bed and Giuliano told him about the cafeterias, the unwritten rules, the safe places and the dangerous ones. He told Vincent that the most important thing was to never be desperate. Desperation made you sloppy. Sloppy got you caught. Vincent saw Giuliano 3 more times over the next month, always the same pattern. Eye contact at Stewart's, a walk, the rooming house, conversation first, then touch, then more conversation. Giuliano never asked Vincent about his life outside that room. Vincent never asked Giuliano. They built a temporary world that existed only in those hours. In August, Vincent went to Stewart's, and Giuliano was not there. Vincent went back the next week. Still no Giuliano. He went every week for 2 months. He never saw him again. 20 years later, in 1947, Vincent was walking through Little Italy and saw a tailor shop on Mulberry Street. The sign said, "Giuliano and Sons." He looked through the window. An old man was measuring a customer for a suit. It was Giuliano. He looked 70, though he could not have been more than 55. His hands shook slightly as he worked. Vincent did not go inside. He stood across the street and watched for 10 minutes. Giuliano never looked up. Vincent walked away. He wrote in the letter that he had wanted to go in and say something. Thank you, maybe. Or just hello. But he did not know what name Giuliano had used at Stewart's. He did not know if Giuliano would even remember him. And he was afraid that walking into that shop and saying the wrong thing might destroy whatever life Giuliano had built. So he left, and he never saw him again. He wrote that he thought about that moment for the rest of his life. The moment of choosing silence over connection. He wrote that it was the price they all paid. The cost of safety was loneliness. The cafeterias were not romantic. This is important to understand. The way they are remembered now, by the few people who remember them at all, there is a tendency to soften them, to make them seem warm and gentle and sweet. They were not. They were fluorescent lit rooms that smelled like burnt coffee and industrial cleaning fluid. The floors were sticky. The tables were scarred with initials and cigarette burns. The coffee was terrible and the food was worse. You could order a sandwich, but you did not want to. The bread was stale. The meat was grey. You stuck to coffee. The men who went there were tired. They worked long hours at bad jobs. They were clerks and delivery drivers and factory workers and dishwashers. A few were professionals, lawyers or accountants or teachers, but most were working class. They wore cheap suits that did not fit well. Their shoes were worn down at the heels. They had bags under their eyes, and they were afraid. Every single one of them was afraid. Afraid of being recognized, afraid of being followed home, afraid of the cops, afraid of blackmail, afraid of their families finding out, afraid of losing their jobs, afraid of violence. The fear was constant, and it was exhausting. But they went anyway, because the alternative was worse. The alternative was complete isolation, was going through your entire life never looking another man in the eye and seeing recognition, never touching another person who wanted to touch you back, never saying out loud the thing you knew about yourself. The cafeterias were not romantic. They were necessary. A man named Eugene O'Neill, not the playwright but a plumber from Queens, went to Clark's Cafeteria on 42nd Street in 1928. He was 31. He had never been with a man. He had tried. He had gone to the piers a few times, but always lost his nerve and left. The piers were too dark, too anonymous, too frightening. The cafeterias felt safer because they were public. There were witnesses. There were lights. If something went wrong, you could call for help. At the piers, if something went wrong, you were alone. Eugene sat at Clark's for 2 hours on his first visit. He drank 4 cups of coffee. He watched the men come and go. No one spoke to him. He went home feeling like he had failed some test he did not understand. He went back the next week. This time a young man sat down across from him. The young man was maybe 20, very thin, with nervous hands. He asked if Eugene had a cigarette. Eugene did not smoke, but he said yes anyway, just to have something to say. The young man laughed and said, "Liar." They talked for 20 minutes. The young man's name was Patrick. He worked at a shoe store in Midtown. He was from Boston. He had been in New York for 3 months. He said he had come to the city to disappear. He said in Boston everyone knew everyone, and you could not be yourself. In New York, you could be no one. And being no one was better than being the wrong someone. Eugene asked if Patrick wanted to take a walk. Patrick said yes. They left the cafeteria together. They walked west toward the Hudson. It was cold, November. The wind off the river cut through their coats. They walked in silence for 15 minutes. Then Patrick stopped. He said, "I should tell you, I do not have a room. I sleep in a boarding house with 6 other men. So if you were thinking we could go somewhere, we cannot." Eugene said he understood. He said he lived with his mother and sister in Queens. He said he could not bring anyone there either. Patrick said, "So we are just walking." Eugene said, "I guess so." They walked for another hour. They talked about their jobs, their families, the city, the weather. Small talk, nothing important. At the end of the walk, Patrick said, "Same time next week?" Eugene said yes. They met every week for 5 months. They never went anywhere private. They just walked. Sometimes they went to the cafeteria first and had coffee. Sometimes they met at a corner and walked from there. They walked through every neighborhood in Manhattan. They walked until their feet hurt, and then they walked more. Patrick told Eugene things he had never told anyone. About being 14 and realizing he was different. About his father finding a letter he had written to another boy and beating him until he could not stand. About leaving home at 17 with $8 and a suitcase and never looking back. Eugene told Patrick about the loneliness, about working 10-hour days fixing pipes and coming home to his mother's apartment and eating dinner in silence and going to bed and lying awake feeling like he was the only person in the world who felt the way he felt. He said meeting Patrick had not fixed the loneliness exactly, but it had made it smaller, made it possible to carry. In April 1929, Patrick told Eugene he was leaving New York. He had been offered a job in Philadelphia, better pay, a chance to start fresh again. He did not ask Eugene to come with him. Eugene did not offer. They met one last time. They walked across the Brooklyn Bridge. It was raining. They stood at the center of the bridge and looked at the city. Patrick said, "Thank you for the walks." Eugene said, "Thank you for the company." Patrick left. Eugene never saw him again. Never learned his last name. Never knew if he made it to Philadelphia, or if the job worked out, or if he found someone else to walk with. But Eugene kept going to Clark's. And eventually he met someone else, and then someone else. And each time it was temporary, and each time it hurt when it ended, and each time he went back anyway. Because the cafeterias taught you that temporary was better than nothing. Taught you that a few months of connection was worth the pain of losing it. Taught you that you could survive goodbyes because there would always be another Tuesday night, another cup of terrible coffee, another man sitting across from you saying, "First time." The summer of 1932 was a bad summer. The Depression was in its third year. A third of the city was unemployed. The bread lines stretched for blocks. Men who had worked their whole lives stood in soup kitchens. Families were evicted and their furniture stacked on the sidewalk. The city felt desperate. Desperation made people cruel. When people are afraid of losing everything, they look for someone to blame, someone beneath them, someone they can point to and say, "At least I am not that." Gay men were that. The newspapers started running more stories about degeneracy, about the moral decay of the city, about unnatural vice. The language was vague, but the target was clear. Reformers called for crackdowns. Ministers preached sermons about Sodom. Politicians promised to clean up the streets. The police responded, not because they cared, but because raids were good publicity. Arresting degenerates made it look like you were doing something. Even if the charges were dropped later, the arrests made the papers. The mayor could point to the numbers and say he was making the city safer. Between June and September 1932, the NYPD raided 18 locations known to be frequented by homosexuals. Cafeterias, parks, bathhouses, hotel bars. They arrested 417 men. Most of the charges were disorderly conduct. Some were vagrancy. A few were sodomy, though those charges almost never stuck because sodomy required proof of the act itself, and that was nearly impossible to obtain. The raids were not about convictions. They were about terror, about reminding gay men that they existed on sufferance, that the cops could destroy their lives anytime they wanted. Stewart's was raided twice that summer, once in July, once in August. The July raid arrested 31 men. The August raid arrested 48. Louis Stewart, the owner, hired a lawyer after the second raid and threatened to sue the city for harassment. The raids on Stewart's stopped, but the damage was done. The men were afraid to come back. By October, Stewart's was nearly empty at night. 10 men where there used to be 80. The ones who came sat alone and did not make eye contact. The warmth was gone. The sense of community was gone. What was left was just a cafeteria selling bad coffee to frightened men. It took 2 years for Stewart's to recover. 2 years of quiet nights and slow rebuilding. The men came back in ones and twos, carefully, testing the waters. By 1934, the crowds were back. Not quite as large as before. more cautious, but back. The thing about resilience is that it looks like weakness until you realize it is the only reason anything survives. The men who went back to the cafeterias after the raids were not being reckless. They were being human. They needed connection more than they needed safety. That is not foolishness. That is courage. A man named Arthur Monroe went to the Life cafeteria in 1935. He was 47 years old. He had been married for 24 years. He had 3 children, all grown. His wife had died 6 months earlier from cancer. He had been a faithful husband. He had loved her. He had never acted on the thing he knew about himself. But now she was gone. And his children were grown and living their own lives. And he was 47 and alone, and he thought, what am I waiting for? He had heard about the cafeterias from a colleague at work. The colleague had not said it directly. He had just mentioned, in passing, that certain places existed. For certain men. If you needed that sort of thing. The colleague had looked at Arthur very carefully when he said it. Arthur had nodded. The colleague had written an address on a slip of paper and handed it across the desk. Arthur went on a Wednesday night. The Life was busy, 50 or 60 men. He felt ancient. Most of the men were in their 20s and 30s. Young and alive and confident in a way he had never been. He almost left. But an older man, maybe 50, caught his eye and smiled, a kind smile. The man gestured to the empty seat at his table. Arthur sat down. The man's name was Bernard. He was a banker, widowed like Arthur. He had been coming to the Life for 3 years. He said, "First time?" Arthur said yes. Bernard said, "It gets less terrifying." They talked for an hour. Bernard told Arthur the rules, the signals, the safe places. He said the most important thing was to be careful, but not paranoid. He said paranoia would eat you alive. He said you had to find the balance between caution and actually living. Arthur asked if Bernard had anyone. Bernard said he did, a man named Thomas. They had been together for 2 years. They did not live together, that would be too risky. But they saw each other several times a week. They had routines. They had in-jokes. They had a life. Arthur said, "How?" Bernard said, "The same way everyone does. One day at a time. One risk at a time." He said, "You cannot have everything. You cannot have the house and the white picket fence and the world's approval. But you can have someone who knows you, really knows you, and that is worth more than you think." Arthur went back to the Life every week for a year. He met men. He had brief affairs. He learned the language, the codes, the geography. He learned how to read a room, how to leave without being followed, how to protect himself. And then, in the spring of 1936, he met a man named Carl. Carl was a librarian. He was 42. He had never been married. He had been alone his whole life. He and Arthur started talking and did not stop for 3 hours. They met again the next week, and the next. Within 6 months, they were seeing each other 3 times a week. They could not live together, but they found ways. Arthur would say he was going to visit a friend upstate. Carl would say he was attending a conference. They would meet at a small hotel in Connecticut and spend the weekend together, pretending they were a normal couple on a normal vacation. Arthur wrote about this in letters to his sister, who lived in California. The letters are part of the Yale University archives. Arthur's sister never married either. She understood in her way. She never said it directly, but her letters back were warm and encouraging. She told him she was glad he had found someone. She told him he deserved happiness. She told him to be careful. Arthur and Carl were together for 11 years. They are buried in the same cemetery in upstate New York. The graves are side by side. The headstones say, "Beloved friend." The word friend doing the work, the word lover could not do. But they met at the Life cafeteria on a Wednesday night in 1936. And that meeting changed both their lives. And none of it would have happened if Arthur had not taken the slip of paper from his colleague and walked through the door. The cafeterias were not just for affairs and hookups. They were also where you found your friends, your chosen family, the people who would show up when you got sick or lost your job or needed money for rent, the people who understood. There was a group of men who met at Stewart's every Saturday night from 1933 to 1941. 6 men. They called themselves the Saturday Club, though it was not really a club. It was just 6 men who had met at the cafeteria at various times and decided they liked each other. There was James, a bookkeeper, Robert, who worked at Macy's, Vincent, a cook, Michael, a taxi driver, Leonard, who played piano in a hotel bar, and David, who was a nurse at Bellevue Hospital. They met every Saturday at 10 p.m. They sat at the same table. They drank coffee and talked about their weeks, their jobs, their families, about men they had met or wanted to meet, about the news, about the war in Europe that felt far away in 1938 but felt much closer by 1941. They loaned each other money when someone was short on rent. They brought food when someone was sick. When Vincent lost his job in 1937, the other 5 pooled their money and gave him enough to cover 2 months' rent until he found new work. When Leonard's mother died in 1939, they all went to the funeral. They sat in the back. They did not say how they knew him, but they were there. The Saturday Club dissolved in 1942 when Robert and Michael were both drafted. James moved to Washington, D.C. for a government job. Vincent got married to a woman because the pressure from his family became unbearable. David stayed in New York. Leonard stayed in New York. But without the others, the Saturday meetings felt wrong. They tried for a few months. Then they stopped. Leonard and David stayed friends for the rest of their lives. They met for coffee, though not at Stewart's, every month until David died in 1978. Leonard died in 1983. His obituary mentioned that he was predeceased by his dear friend David. But from 1933 to 1941, every Saturday night, 6 men sat at a table at Stewart's and were family to each other. And that mattered. It still matters. The thing about the cafeterias is that they were ordinary, deeply, profoundly ordinary, and that ordinariness was revolutionary. Gay men were told by every institution in society that they were abnormal, sick, perverted, criminal, that they were alone, that what they felt was shameful and wrong. The medical establishment said they were mentally ill. The churches said they were sinful. The law said they were criminal. Their families said they were disappointments. And then they walked into a cafeteria and saw 80 other men who felt exactly the same way. And the whole story they had been told about themselves fell apart. You were not alone. You were not the only one. You were not sick or broken or wrong. You were just gay. And there were thousands of others. They worked regular jobs. They had families. They laughed and argued and fell in love and had their hearts broken just like everyone else. They were ordinary. The cafeterias proved that being gay was not an aberration. It was a variation, a common variation, common enough to fill a room, common enough to need gathering places, common enough to build a community. That was the real threat, not sex, not sodomy, not individual acts of vice. The threat was community. The threat was gay men realizing they were not alone and did not have to live in isolation and shame. The authorities understood this. That is why they raided the cafeterias, even when no laws were being broken inside them. Because the gathering itself was dangerous. Because men who knew they were not alone were harder to control. Every revolution begins with people sitting in a room together, realizing they share something the world told them was shameful. That is what the cafeterias were. Small revolutions that happened every night at midnight. The authorities could not arrest people for sitting quietly drinking coffee, but they could make the experience terrifying. They could station officers outside. They could write down license plate numbers. They could follow men home. They could show up at their workplaces the next day and ask questions. Very polite questions. Just routine follow-up questions. And then the employer would fire the man, and the man would understand the message. This happened to a man named Albert Guerrero in 1938. Albert was 29. He worked as a clerk at an insurance company on Madison Avenue. He went to Stewart's on Friday nights. He was careful. He never left with anyone. He just sat and drank coffee and talked to the regulars. It was social. Safe. Or so he thought. A plainclothes officer started coming to Stewart's in March of 1938. He sat alone. He looked like any other customer. He came back 3 weeks in a row. The 4th week, he sat down at Albert's table. He introduced himself as William. He said he was new to the city. He asked if Albert knew any good places to go. Albert, being kind, told him about a few restaurants, a park that was nice in spring. Nothing incriminating, just friendly conversation. William thanked him. They talked for 20 minutes. William left. Albert thought nothing of it. The following Monday, 2 police officers came to Albert's office. They asked to speak with him. They took him to a private room. They showed him a photograph. It was Albert sitting at Stewart's. The photograph had been taken through the window. You could see him clearly. You could see William sitting across from him. The officers said they were investigating a vice ring. They said William was actually Officer William Patterson, undercover. They said they knew Albert frequented establishments known for homosexual activity. They said they had photographs of him at Stewart's on 6 different nights over the past 2 months. Albert said he had done nothing illegal. He had just been drinking coffee. The officers agreed. They said he was not being charged with anything. They just wanted to ask some questions. They wanted names. They wanted to know who else went to Stewart's, who the regular customers were, what they talked about. Albert said he did not know anyone's name. The officers said that was a lie. They said if he cooperated, this could all go away quietly. If he did not cooperate, they would have to speak with his employer. Just routine follow-up. Just making sure the company knew what kind of man they had working for them. Albert understood. He gave them 3 names. Men he barely knew. Men who had been friendly to him. Men whose real names he did not actually know. So he made up last names that sounded plausible. The officers wrote everything down. They thanked him for his cooperation. They left. Albert was fired that afternoon. His supervisor called him in and said the company had decided to reorganize and his position was being eliminated. Effective immediately. 2 weeks severance. The supervisor would not make eye contact. Albert never went back to Stewart's. He was too afraid. He found work eventually at a smaller firm that paid less. He never told anyone what had happened. He moved through his life quietly, carefully, never taking risks again. He told this story in 1981 to an interviewer from the New York Public Library's Oral History Project. He was 72. He cried while he told it. He said the thing that haunted him was not losing his job. It was giving those 3 names. He said he had probably destroyed 3 other lives to save his own. He said he thought about those men every day for 43 years. He said he hoped they had survived. He said he would never know. The interviewer asked if he thought cooperating had been wrong. Albert said, "I do not know. What would you have done?" The interviewer did not answer. That was the machinery of oppression. It did not require mass arrests. It just required enough fear, spread strategically, that people policed themselves, that they stayed quiet, that they informed on each other, that they learned the cost of visibility was too high. And still, the cafeterias filled up every night. Still, men came back, because the need for connection was stronger than fear. Not everyone who went to the cafeterias was looking for romance or sex. Some men just needed to be in a room where they did not have to pretend. A man named Morris Feinberg went to the Automat on 14th Street every Thursday night from 1930 to 1936. He was 53 when he started going. He had been married for 28 years. His wife had died in 1929. His children were grown. He lived alone in a one-bedroom apartment in the Bronx. Morris had known he was attracted to men since he was a teenager. He had never acted on it. He had married because that was what you did. He had loved his wife in his way. He had been a good husband and father. He had built a life. But his wife was gone now. And he was 53 and alone, and he thought, I would like to spend one evening a week, not lying. He did not go to the automat looking for sex. He was too old, too tired, too aware of his limitations. He went because he wanted to sit in a room where other men understood, where he did not have to perform heterosexuality, where he could just be. He sat at the same table every week. He brought a book. He drank coffee. He watched the younger men flirt and leave together, and he felt no jealousy. He just felt grateful that they had what he had never had, that they were finding each other. Sometimes other older men sat near him. They did not talk much, just nodded in recognition. Fellow travelers. Men who had spent their youth hiding and were spending their old age in quiet defiance, just by being present, just by refusing to disappear completely. Morris kept a journal. The journal was found after his death in 1952 by his daughter. She read it. She burned it. But before she burned it, she copied one entry into her own diary. That diary was donated to the Lesbian Herstory Archives in 1996 after the daughter died. The entry, dated November 14th, 1933, reads, Tonight at the automat, I sat next to a man who must have been 70. We did not speak, but when he stood to leave, he put his hand on my shoulder for just a moment. Just a touch. Just acknowledgement. I walked home feeling less alone than I've felt in 30 years. That touch, that moment, that was what the cafeterias offered to men like Morris. Not romance, not sex, just the knowledge that you were not the only one who had lived your whole life in a cage. Morris went to the automat every Thursday for 6 years. When he died, his obituary said he was a retired accountant who loved books and classical music. It said he was predeceased by his beloved wife. It said nothing about the Thursday nights. But they happened, and they mattered to him, and now we know. The late 1930s brought changes. The city was pulling out of the Depression. Jobs were coming back. The mood was lighter. The raids decreased. The police had other priorities. The cafeterias felt safer, and into that slightly safer world walked a new generation. Men who were younger, bolder. Men who had grown up knowing the cafeterias existed and did not have to spend years in isolation before finding them. A man named Daniel Rosenberg went to the Life Cafeteria in 1938. He was 20 years old. He was a student at City College. He was studying literature. He had read the poets. He knew about Whitman and his men. He knew about the Greek symposia. He had read Edward Carpenter's writings on the intermediate sex. He had language for what he was. He had theory. What he did not have was experience. He went to the Life on a Saturday night in April. The place was packed. He had never seen so many gay men in one place. He stood in line for coffee and just stared. Men in beautiful suits. Men with carefully styled hair. Men laughing loudly, unafraid. This was nothing like the furtive shame he had imagined. He sat down with his coffee, and within 5 minutes, 3 different men had smiled at him. One of them sat down without asking. The man was maybe 25, blonde, strikingly handsome. He said, "You look lost." Daniel said, "I am new." The man said, "Everyone is new once. My name is Richard." Richard worked in advertising. He lived in a studio apartment on the Upper West Side. He had been out, as he called it, since he was 18. He talked about being gay the way Daniel talked about books, with casual expertise, with pleasure. Daniel asked how Richard could be so open. Richard laughed. He said, "I am not open. I am careful. There is a difference." He said you could live a whole life as a gay man in New York if you learned the rules. You kept your professional life separate. You did not bring men home to your family. You had two faces. But within the gay world, within places like this, you could be yourself. He said the trick was not trying to change the whole world. The trick was building a smaller world inside the bigger one, a parallel world, the cafeterias, the bars that were just starting to open, the house parties in the village, the summer houses on Fire Island. There was a whole infrastructure now. You just had to know how to find it. Daniel and Richard left the cafeteria together. They walked through Washington Square Park. It was spring, warm. The trees were blooming. Richard took Daniel to a party in a townhouse on 10th Street. The party was full of gay men, 30 or 40 of them, drinking, talking, laughing. No one looked afraid. Daniel asked who owned the house. Richard said a man named Frederick. Frederick was independently wealthy, old family money. He threw parties every Saturday. Everyone was welcome as long as they were discreet coming and going. No loud goodbyes on the stoop. No clustering on the sidewalk. You came alone or in pairs, quietly, and you left the same way. Inside the house, you could be loud. You could dance. You could kiss your boyfriend if you wanted. Frederick employed two men whose only job was to watch the street and warn if police came near. It had happened once, in 1936. The warning went out. Everyone hid their drinks. The music stopped. By the time the police knocked, it looked like a quiet dinner party. The police looked around, found nothing illegal, and left. The party resumed 10 minutes later. Daniel stayed until 3 in the morning. He met dozens of men, writers, artists, actors, teachers, bankers, shop clerks, men from every class and background. The only thing they had in common was that they were gay, and that was enough. Richard walked him to the subway. He said, "You know this exists now. You will never be able to unknow it. You can go back to pretending if you want. But you will always know there is another option." Daniel did not go back to pretending. He became a regular at the Life. He went to Frederick's parties. He met a man named Thomas at a party in June. They dated for 2 years. It ended badly, the way young love often does. Daniel was heartbroken for 6 months. Then he met someone else. He lived his whole life in that parallel world Richard had described. He had a career as a professor. He published books on American poetry. He was respected in his field. And he had a private life that his colleagues knew nothing about. He had lovers, friends, a community. He had a life. He died in 1994 at the age of 76. His obituary in the Times mentioned his scholarly work. It mentioned that he never married. It did not mention Thomas or the 5 other men he loved over the years. It did not mention the Life cafeteria or the Saturday night parties, but they happened. And they shaped him. And the fact that we know about them now is because Daniel donated his papers to the New York Public Library before he died. He wanted someone to know. He wanted the history preserved. The cafeterias were not utopias. They had hierarchies. They had cruelties. They had the same prejudices that existed in the wider world, just compressed into a smaller space. If you were young and beautiful, you had power. Men wanted to talk to you, to be seen with you, to take you home. If you were older, or plain, or poor, you had less. You sat alone more often. You were ignored. If you were white, you had more access. Most of the cafeterias in Manhattan were implicitly segregated, not by law, not by signs, but by unspoken understanding. Black gay men had their own spaces, mostly in Harlem. The downtown cafeterias were white spaces. A black man walking into Stewart's would not be refused service, but he would be looked at, made to feel unwelcome. Most did not bother trying. A man named James Baldwin, who would later become one of America's greatest writers, went to the Life cafeteria once in 1942. He was 18. He had heard about it from a white friend. He walked in. Every head turned. The room went quiet. He ordered coffee. He sat down. No one spoke to him. After 20 minutes, he left. He wrote about it years later in an essay. He said the cafeterias were proof that gay liberation was not enough, that you could build gay spaces and still replicate the racism of the larger society, that the fight was always multiple fights at once. He said he never went back to the white cafeterias. He found his community in Harlem at places like the Clam House and the Hot Jar, where black gay men gathered. The racism in the cafeterias was real, it was documented, and it matters that we do not romanticize these places as perfect refuges. They were imperfect refuges. They were better than nothing. They saved lives. But they were also complicit in the racial hierarchies of their time. The same was true for class. The men who could afford nicer clothes, who had professional jobs, who spoke with educated accents, they had more power in these spaces. The working class men, the ones who wore cheap suits and worked with their hands, they were often treated as less desirable, less worthy of attention. The historian Geoffrey Escoffier, writing in the 1990s, interviewed several men who'd been regulars at the cafeterias in the 1930s and 40s. He asked about class dynamics. One man, who had been a factory worker, said, "If you did not dress right, the better-looking men would not even see you. You were furniture." Another man, who had worked as a janitor, said he stopped going to Stewart's after a few months because he felt invisible. He said, "The young men in their nice suits, they looked right through me. I was too poor, too old, too ugly. I went to the piers instead. At least there, in the dark, everyone was equal. The piers were more democratic in their way. No lights meant no judgment based on appearance, but they were also more dangerous, more anonymous, more brutal. The cafeterias offered community, but that community had gates. Not everyone was equally welcome inside." This tension, between the need for safe spaces and the way those spaces could replicate oppression, is not unique to the cafeterias. It is the tension in every marginalized community. We build what we can. We make it as safe as we can. But we bring our prejudices with us. The work of liberation is not just escaping the oppressor. It is unlearning the oppressor's lessons. The cafeterias began to decline in the 1940s. The war changed everything. Millions of men were drafted. The ones who stayed were working in defense plants, long shifts, no time for late-night coffee. The city felt emptier. And then, after the war, the world changed again. The men came back from Europe and the Pacific. Many of them had had experiences overseas. In Paris, in London, in San Francisco, where they shipped out from, they had discovered gay bars. Actual bars, where you could drink and dance, where the atmosphere was less furtive, more festive. They came back to New York wanting that. And slowly, the bars began to open. The gay bars of the 1950s were often mafia-run, frequently raided, deeply problematic in their own ways. But they offered something the cafeterias did not. They offered music, dancing, alcohol, a sense of occasion. The cafeterias started to feel old-fashioned, a place for an older generation. The younger men wanted the bars. They wanted to dance with each other. They wanted to drink and flirt and take risks the cafeterias had never allowed. By 1950, Stewart's was no longer the center of gay New York. It was still there. Men still went. But the crowds were smaller, older. The energy had moved elsewhere. The light cafeteria stayed popular longer because it adapted. The owner started allowing a jukebox in the corner. He looked the other way when men slow danced after 2 a.m. He made the space feel less like a cafeteria and more like a proto-bar. But even the light was losing ground to the actual bars that were opening in the village. Stewart's closed in 1958, not because of a raid or a scandal, just because Louis Stewart retired and none of his daughters wanted to run the business. The building was sold. It became a coffee shop, then a deli, then a chain drugstore. Now it is luxury condos. There is no plaque, nothing to mark what happened there. The Life Cafeteria closed in 1965. The building was demolished. The site is now a parking lot. The Automat on 14th Street survived until 1991, but its gay clientele had moved on decades earlier. By the 1970s, it was just an automat, old people and tourists. The gay history was forgotten. The Black Rabbit, the lesbian cafeteria, closed in 1929 and was never replaced. Lesbian spaces were always more fragile, always more invisible, always more likely to be erased from history entirely. But for 20 years, from roughly 1925 to 1945, the cafeterias were the center of gay New York. They were where you went to find yourself, where you went to find others, where you learned the rules of a world the straight world refused to acknowledge existed. There is a photograph in the New York Public Library archives. It is dated 1934. It shows the interior of a cafeteria. You can see the tables, the chairs, the counter in the background. You can see about 15 men. They are sitting at tables, some alone, some in pairs. They are just drinking coffee, talking, looking at each other. The photograph is catalogued as Interior of Stewart's Cafeteria, Greenwich Village, 1934. There is no mention of why the photograph was taken or by whom. There is no notation that this was a gay gathering place. To anyone looking at it without context, it is just a boring photograph of a boring cafeteria. But if you know what you are looking at, the photograph is extraordinary, because these are gay men, living their lives, in public, in 1934, when everything in society told them they had to hide. Look at their faces. Some of them are smiling, some look tired, some look wary, but they are there. They showed up. They took the risk. They sat in that room together and refused to be completely invisible. The photograph is evidence, not just that gay men existed in 1934, though it is that, but that they found each other, that they built spaces, that they created community out of nothing, that they survived. Most of the men in that photograph are dead now. We do not know their names. We do not know what happened to them after the shutter closed. We do not know if they found love or died alone. We do not know if they lived into old age or were destroyed by the raids or the blackmail or the shame. But we know they were there, on that day, in that cafeteria, together. And that is not nothing. That is the whole point. They were there. When historians talk about gay history before Stonewall, they often speak in abstractions. They talk about oppression and invisibility and the closet. They use statistics. They cite laws. They describe the psychiatric establishment and the police apparatus and the cultural attitudes. All of that is true and necessary, but it misses something essential. It misses the actual texture of living, the small daily negotiations, the moments of joy that happened anyway, the friendships that saved lives, the ordinary Tuesday nights that mattered more than grand historical events. The cafeterias were made of Tuesday nights. A man named Henry Gottlieb went to Child's Restaurant every Tuesday for 9 years, from 1933 to 1942. He was a bookkeeper at a textile firm. He lived with his elderly mother in a walk-up on the Lower East Side. He was 31 when he started going, 40 when he stopped. He never had a relationship, never met anyone at Child's who became more than a brief encounter. He was not particularly handsome. He was shy. He had trouble talking to men he found attractive. Most Tuesday nights he sat alone at his usual table and just watched. But he kept going. Every single Tuesday. Because those few hours in that room were the only time all week when he felt like himself. When he did not have to monitor every word, every gesture, every glance. When he could look at another man and not have to immediately look away. Henry kept a small notebook, just a pocket diary where he recorded his daily expenses. Lunch, 35 cents. Subway, 10 cents. Coffee at Child's, 10 cents. The entries are repetitive and boring except for one detail. Every Tuesday entry has a small star drawn next to it. Just a pencil star. No explanation. The notebook is in the New York Public Library. It was donated by Henry's niece in 1997. She included a note saying she found the notebook after her uncle died in 1979. She said she did not understand the stars until she read George Chauncey's book and realized what Childs had been. She said she wished she had known while he was alive. She said she wished she could have told him it was all right. Henry spent 9 years marking every Tuesday with a star. 9 years of 10-cent coffee and silent watching, and that was his life. That was how he survived. Not dramatic, not tragic, just quiet and persistent. The stars marking time, marking the nights when he got to be himself, even if only as an observer. When World War II started, Henry was too old to be drafted. But the cafeteria changed anyway. Fewer men, different energy. By 1943, it felt pointless. He stopped going. The notebook entries for Tuesday after that have no stars, just the date and his expenses. The absence of the star is somehow more devastating than anything he could have written. The war years were strange for the cafeterias. On one hand, the raids decreased because the police had actual crime to worry about. The black market, draft dodgers, espionage fears. Homosexuals drinking coffee seemed less urgent. On the other hand, the crowds thinned. So many men were gone. The ones who remained were working long hours in defense plants or government offices. The cafeterias stayed open, but they felt empty, haunted by the absence of the men who used to fill them. A man named Walter Koenig went to the Life cafeteria in 1943. He was 4F, rejected from military service due to a heart murmur. He worked as a clerk at a draft board office in Brooklyn. Every day he processed paperwork for men being sent overseas. Every day he felt the guilt of staying home. The guilt was compounded by relief. He knew what happened to gay men in the military if they were discovered. Dishonorable discharge, public humiliation, sometimes violence from other soldiers. He was safer at home. But safety felt like cowardice. He went to the Life on Thursday nights. The cafeteria was half empty. Maybe 20 men where there used to be 80. The mood was subdued. Everyone was thinking about the war, about the men who were gone, about whether they would come back. Walter met a man named Joseph at the Life in May of 1943. Joseph was also 4F, flat feet. He worked at a shipyard in Brooklyn, doing welding. They sat together and talked about the guilt, about feeling like they were failing some test of manhood by not being in uniform. Joseph said, "At least we are alive. The men over there, a lot of them are not coming back. We get to be here. We get to have this." He gestured at the cafeteria, at the handful of other men scattered at tables. This terrible coffee, and this sticky floor in each other. Walter asked if Joseph thought it was selfish to be grateful. Joseph said probably. "But I am grateful anyway." They saw each other every Thursday for the rest of the war. They never became lovers. The chemistry was not there. But they became friends. Close friends. The kind of friends who kept each other sane through years of ambient dread. In 1945, when the war ended, the men started coming back. The cafeterias filled up again. Walter and Joseph kept meeting on Thursdays, but now the room was crowded, loud, full of returned soldiers telling stories, looking for connection, trying to rebuild lives that had been interrupted. Some of the soldiers had been changed by the war. They had seen gay life in Europe. They had been with men in Paris or London or Berlin. They came back less willing to hide, more impatient with the old rules. This created tension. The older men, the ones who had survived the 1930s raids, tried to enforce caution. Keep your voice down. Do not touch. Do not draw attention. The younger men, especially the veterans, pushed back. They had survived a war. They were less afraid of the police. Walter watched this generational shift with fascination. He was 37 in 1945, old enough to remember the terror of the early raids, young enough to be moved by the veterans' boldness. He did not know which side he was on. Joseph sided with caution. He said, They are going to get us all arrested. Their loudness is dangerous. Walter said, maybe, or maybe things are changing. Joseph said, things do not change, not for us. That conversation happened in October 1945. By 1946, Joseph was proved at least partly right. The post-war crackdown began. The police, with less to do now that the war was over, turned their attention back to moral enforcement. The raids resumed, harder than before. But Walter was also partly right. Things were changing, slowly, unevenly. But the men coming back from the war had tasted a different kind of freedom. They were not going to go back to the old silence completely. That tension between caution and boldness would define the next 20 years, would eventually lead to Stonewall. But in 1945, in the Life cafeteria, it just felt like an argument between friends. The cafeterias were also where you learned the codes, the language, the signals that let you navigate the gay world without getting caught. A man named Eddie Ramirez went to Stewart's in 1937. He was 18. He had just moved to New York from Puerto Rico. He spoke almost no English. He knew no one. He had heard from a cousin that there were places in New York where men like him could go. The cousin had been vague. Eddie went looking. He found Stewart's by accident. He was walking through the village, lost, looking for a cheap place to eat. He saw the cafeteria. He walked in. He immediately felt something different about the room, the way the men looked at each other, the way they sat. He understood before anyone said a word. He sat down with his coffee. An older Puerto Rican man, maybe 40, sat across from him. The man spoke in Spanish. He said, "First time?" Eddie nodded. The man's name was Ramon. He had been in New York for 15 years. He worked as a janitor at a hotel in Midtown. He took Eddie under his wing. Over the next few months, Ramon taught Eddie everything. He taught him the English words. Gay did not mean what Eddie thought it meant. Queer was starting to be used by some men to describe themselves, reclaimed from the insult. Fairy was what other people called you, usually before they hit you. Trade meant a man who would sleep with you but did not identify as gay himself, usually for money or gifts. He taught him the clothing signals. A red tie meant you were actively looking. A green handkerchief in your left pocket meant one thing, in your right pocket another. The code shifted constantly. You had to pay attention. He taught him the geography. Which parks were safe at what times, which subway bathrooms were known spots, which piers were patrolled by police, and which were left alone, which bars had opened, and which had been shut down. He taught him how to talk to cops if you were stopped. Be polite. Be boring. Give them nothing to latch onto. Do not run. Running made you look guilty. If they searched you and found something incriminating, a love letter or an address book with too many men's names, you were in trouble. So do not carry anything incriminating. He taught him how to read a room, how to tell the difference between a cop and a civilian. Cops sat differently. They watched differently. They asked questions that felt slightly wrong. You developed an instinct for it, or you got arrested. Ramon told Eddie about the raids, about what happened if you got arrested, your name in the paper, your family finding out, your job gone. He said, the goal is to never let it get that far. Be smart. Be careful. Survive. Eddie listened. He learned. He became part of the community at Stewart's. He met other Puerto Rican men, other immigrants. The cafeteria was full of men from everywhere. Irish, Italian, Jewish, German, Polish, Greek, Puerto Rican, Mexican. All of them trying to build lives in a city that barely tolerated them. The immigrant men often had it harder. They faced racism on top of homophobia. They were more vulnerable to deportation if arrested. They had fewer resources. Many of them sent money back to families in the old country and could not afford to lose their jobs. But they also had each other. The cafeterias were international. You could hear 6 languages at 6 different tables. The common language was desire, was the shared experience of being unwanted by the straight world. Eddie stayed in New York for 11 years. He worked in restaurants, learned English, became an American citizen. He had relationships. He had heartbreaks. He built a life. In 1948, he met a man named Thomas at Stewart's. Thomas was a teacher, white, middle class. They fell in love. It was complicated. Thomas's family did not know he was gay. They certainly did not know he was dating a Puerto Rican man. Eddie and Thomas saw each other in secret for 2 years. In 1950, Thomas was offered a job in California. He asked Eddie to come with him. Eddie said yes. They moved to Los Angeles together. They told people they were roommates. They lived that lie for 33 years. When Thomas died in 1983, Eddie was not allowed to attend the funeral. The family said he was not family. But Eddie wrote about Thomas in a letter to a friend in 1995. The letter is in the One archives. Eddie wrote that the best years of his life were the 2 years when they first met, when they would meet at Stewart's and then walk through the village talking, when everything was new and possible and terrifying. He wrote that Thomas was the love of his life. He wrote that he wished he could have said that out loud while Thomas was alive. Eddie died in 1998. He was 79. He left his papers to the archives because he wanted someone to know. He wanted the story of the Puerto Rican men at Stewart's to be remembered. He wanted Ramon to be remembered. Ramon, who had taught him how to survive. We do not know Ramon's last name. Eddie never wrote it down. But Ramon was there, teaching the new arrivals, keeping people safe. That was his contribution to gay history. Unrecorded except for Eddie's testimony, but real. The cafeterias were not just social spaces. They were also economic networks. Men found jobs through the cafeteria connections, found apartments, borrowed money, built the informal support systems that let them survive. A man named Samuel Horowitz lost his job in 1936. He was a typist at a law firm. Someone had seen him at Stewart's and told his boss. The boss called him in and said the firm had to let him go. No explanation, no severance. Just go. Samuel went to Stewart's that night and told the men at his usual table what had happened. 3 of them offered him money, just loans. Pay it back when you can. One of them knew about a job opening at a publishing house. He gave Samuel the name of the hiring manager. He said, "Tell him Frank sent you. He will know." Samuel got the job. It paid less than the law firm, but it was something. He paid back the loans within 6 months. And when another man at Stewart's lost his job 2 years later, Samuel was one of the first to offer money. This was how it worked. The formal economy was hostile. The informal economy, the gay economy, filled the gaps. You helped each other because you knew the straight world would not help you. You built networks of mutual aid because survival required it. The historian Brett Beeman, writing about gay urban life in the early 20th century, found dozens of examples of these informal support networks centered around the cafeterias. Men who shared apartments to save money. Men who loaned each other rent. Men who provided alibis when someone needed to explain a late night or a suspicious absence. There was a rooming house on 12th Street near 6th Avenue that was known to be gay-friendly. The landlady, a widow named Mrs. Chen, rented rooms to single men and asked no questions. She charged slightly below market rate because she knew her tenants were vulnerable. She never raised the rent if someone lost a job. She let people pay late without penalties. Mrs. Chen was not gay herself. She was just a practical woman who saw an underserved market and also happened to be kind. When she died in 1951, over 100 men attended her funeral. The funeral home was confused. They asked the family who all these men were. The family said they did not know. The men were her tenants and former tenants, the men she had kept safe. One of those men, Roger Klein, wrote about Mrs. Chen in a letter to the Mattachine Society in 1955. He said she had saved his life. He had been evicted from 2 previous apartments when landlords discovered he was gay. He had been homeless for 3 weeks when someone at Stewart's told him about Mrs. Chen. She rented him a room. She never asked invasive questions. She treated him with simple human dignity. Roger wrote that Mrs. Chen represented something important. She was proof that not everyone in the straight world was hostile. That some people, even if they did not fully understand, could still choose kindness. He wrote that he wished more people were like her. The cafeterias were where you learned about people like Mrs. Chen, where information circulated, where you found out which doctors would treat you without reporting you, which lawyers would defend you if you were arrested, which bail bondsman would show up at 3 a.m., which funeral homes would bury you without asking too many questions about the man sobbing in the back row. All of this information was shared over coffee, whispered, passed along, remembered. The cafeterias were information networks as much as social spaces. They were survival infrastructure. There were moments of pure joy in the cafeterias, not just relief or safety or survival, actual joy. A man named Christopher Wells went to the Life Cafeteria on New Year's Eve in 1938. He was 25. He had been in New York for 3 years. He had a job he liked, at a bookstore in the village. He had friends. He had a life that felt, most days, almost normal. New Year's Eve at the Life was always special. The management looked the other way about alcohol. Men brought flasks. Someone always brought a radio. At midnight, everyone sang Auld Lang Syne. It was the one night a year when the cafeteria felt less like a hiding place and more like a celebration. Christopher arrived at 11. The place was packed, standing room only. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of cheap whiskey and too many bodies in a small space. The radio was playing dance music. Men were dancing together, openly, in a public cafeteria, on 6th Avenue. Christopher watched in amazement. He had never seen anything like it. 2 men waltzing near the counter, 3 men doing a clumsy Lindy hop by the window, an older couple swaying slowly in the corner. No one was stopping them. The staff was ignoring it. The other customers were cheering. At 11:45, someone turned up the radio for the countdown. The announcer was broadcasting from Times Square. You could hear the crowd in the background, hundreds of thousands of people waiting for the ball to drop. At midnight, the cafeteria erupted. Men kissing, hugging, singing. Someone popped a bottle of champagne that sprayed all over the floor. Someone else started crying, happy crying. The kind of crying that comes from relief so intense it has to escape your body somehow. Christopher found himself hugging a stranger, a man he had never met. They held each other for a long moment. The man said, "Happy New Year." Christopher said it back. They let go. They never learned each other's names. Christopher wrote about that night in a diary entry dated January 1st, 1939. He wrote that it was the happiest moment of his life so far. Not because anything extraordinary had happened. Just because for one night, in one room, no one was afraid. For one night, they got to be normal. Got to celebrate like everyone else. Got to kiss at midnight like lovers were supposed to. He wrote that he knew it could not last. That tomorrow they would all go back to hiding. But tonight, for a few hours, they had been free. And that was enough. That had to be enough. The next night, Christopher went back to the Life. It was a regular Monday night. No music, no dancing, no alcohol. Just men sitting quietly drinking coffee. The magic was gone, but the memory remained, and the knowledge that it could happen again, that once a year they got New Year's Eve. The women had their own version of this. The Black Rabbit, before it closed, had its own celebrations. Quieter, smaller, but real. A woman named Dorothy Myers went to the Black Rabbit in 1928. She was 32. She worked as a secretary at a publishing house. She lived alone in a studio apartment on 8th Street. She had known she preferred women since she was 16. She had never acted on it. She had spent 16 years believing she was the only one. Someone at her office, another secretary, had mentioned the Black Rabbit, just in passing. Just a comment about a place where certain women went. The other secretary had given Dorothy a long look when she said it. Dorothy had understood. She went on a Saturday night. The cafeteria was small, maybe 20 women inside. Some in trousers, some in dresses, some with short hair, some with long. All of them looking at each other with a recognition that made Dorothy's heart race. She ordered coffee and sat down. A woman across the room smiled at her. Dorothy smiled back. That was all, just a smile, but it meant everything. Dorothy kept going to the Black Rabbit every Saturday for a year. She made friends. She met a woman named Helen. They dated for 3 months. It ended amicably. They remained friends. Dorothy wrote about the Black Rabbit in letters to her sister, who lived in Ohio. The letters are in the Schlesinger Library at Harvard. Dorothy never explicitly said what the Black Rabbit was, but she wrote about the women she met there, about feeling less alone, about having a place to go where she could be herself. When the Black Rabbit closed in 1929, Dorothy was devastated. She wrote to her sister that she felt like she had lost her home, that she did not know where to go now, that the city felt empty without that one room. She found other places eventually, private parties, other women's apartments, but she wrote that it was never quite the same as the cafeteria. The cafeteria had been public. You did not need an invitation, you just went. That accessibility mattered. Dorothy never had a long-term relationship. She lived alone for most of her life. But she had friendships. She had community. She had nights at the Black Rabbit when she danced with other women and felt beautiful and wanted and normal. She died in 1967. She was 71. Her obituary said she was a retired secretary who loved books and classical music. It said she never married. It did not mention Helen or the Black Rabbit or the Saturday nights that had meant everything. But we know now. Because Dorothy kept the letters. Because her niece donated them to the archive. Because someone cared enough to preserve the story. By the late 1940s, the cafeteria era was ending. The spaces were still there, but their primacy was fading. The gay bars were opening. The house parties were becoming more elaborate. The infrastructure was shifting. But the men who had found themselves in the cafeterias never forgot. They carried those experiences for the rest of their lives. A man named Philip Johnson, the architect who would later design the glass house and become famous, went to Stewart's in 1932 when he was 26. He went a few times. He was too wealthy and too ambitious to make it a regular habit. He had access to more exclusive gay circles, private clubs, high society parties where discretion was assured by the guest list. But he wrote in a letter to a friend in 1933 that the cafeteria had moved him, that seeing working-class gay men building community out of nothing had shown him something important about resilience. He wrote that he would never forget the men at Stewart's, that they had more courage than anyone he knew. Philip Johnson lived until 2005. He was 98. In his later years, he gave interviews about his life. He talked about his architecture, his career, his mistakes, and he talked about being gay. In a 1993 interview, he mentioned the cafeterias. He said they were where gay urban life really began, not in the bars, not in the private clubs, in the cheap cafeterias where ordinary men gathered. He said those men built the foundation that everything else rested on. The interviewer asked if he wished he had spent more time in those spaces. Philip said yes. He said he had been young and arrogant and class-conscious. He had thought himself above the cafeterias. He said that was one of his great regrets, that he had not fully participated in that moment of community building. He said, "They were braver than I was. They had more to lose and they showed up anyway." That bravery is what we remember now. Not the fear, though the fear was real. Not the raids, though the raids were devastating. Not the names in the newspapers or the lost jobs or the ruined lives. We remember the men who showed up anyway, who sat at those tables, who drank that terrible coffee, who looked at each other and said, without words, "You are not alone." The cafeterias existed in the gap between what was legal and what was possible. They were not illegal. You could not be arrested just for sitting there, but you could be arrested for what the police imagined you might do later, for what your presence in that space implied, for being the kind of person who went to that kind of place. And still, every night, the men came back. A man named Sidney Lester went to the Automat on 14th Street every Friday night from 1940 to 1948. He was a high school teacher. He taught English literature. He was 42 when he started going, 50 when he stopped. Sidney never met anyone at the Automat, never had a relationship, never even had a meaningful conversation. He just went. He sat at the same table. He drank his coffee. He read his book. He watched the other men come and go. In 1955, 7 years after he stopped going, Sidney wrote a letter to a former student who had confided in him about being gay. The student was terrified. He was 19. He thought he was sick. He thought he was the only one. Sidney wrote back. The letter is in the Cornell University archives, donated by the student decades later. Sidney wrote about the Automat, about the hundreds of men he had seen there over 8 years. He wrote that being gay was not a sickness or a sin. He wrote that there were more of them than anyone wanted to admit. He wrote that the student would find his people, that he would survive, that it would get better. He wrote, "You think you are alone. You are not. There are rooms full of us. We have been here all along. We will be here after you. You are joining something, not inventing it. And that should give you courage." The student kept that letter his entire life. He read it whenever he felt hopeless. He said it saved him more than once. When Sidney died in 1972, the student attended the funeral. He tried to tell Sidney's family what the letter had meant. They looked at him blankly. They did not understand. He stopped trying to explain, but he kept the letter. And when he donated his papers to Cornell in 2003, he included a note. The note said that Sidney Lester had been one of the bravest men he ever knew, that Sidney had risked his career just by writing that letter, that teachers in 1955 could be fired for even acknowledging homosexuality existed, that Sidney had done it anyway because a frightened kid needed help. The student wrote, "He sat in that cafeteria for 8 years, just sat there. He never told me why he stopped going, but he went for 8 years and it mattered. It mattered to him, and his telling me about it mattered to me, and now I am telling you, that is how we survive. We pass it along." The last of the men who went to the cafeterias in the 1920s and 30s are gone now. The youngest of them would be over 100 years old. They took their memories with them, the conversations, the faces, the names they never wrote down, the moments that felt too small to record, but were actually everything. What we have left are fragments, a photograph, a diary entry, a letter, a court transcript, an interview recorded decades later when the memory was already fading. We piece together the story from these fragments and we do our best to honor what happened. But the gaps are enormous. We know the famous men who went to the cafeterias because famous people leave records. We know less about the working class men, almost nothing about the men who were too afraid to leave any trace. Nothing about the men who used fake names or burned their diaries or destroyed the evidence of their lives to protect themselves or their families. For every story we have, there are 1,000 we will never know. For every photograph, there are 1,000 rooms full of men who were never photographed. For every letter preserved, there are 10,000 letters burned. This is the nature of queer history. It is a history of absence as much as presence. The archive is full of ghosts, people who were deliberately erased, people who erased themselves because erasure was safer than visibility. But even the erasure tells us something. It tells us the stakes. It tells us what they were up against. It tells us that every scrap of evidence that survived was a small miracle. Someone deciding not to burn the letter. Someone keeping the diary. Someone, decades later, donating it to an archive because they wanted the story told, even if they could not tell it themselves while they were alive. The cafeterias mattered because they were proof. Proof that gay men existed in numbers large enough to fill a room. Proof that they found each other despite everything designed to keep them apart. Proof that they built lives and communities and networks of care in a world that wanted them dead or invisible, preferably both. And the proof survived. Not all of it, but enough. Enough to reconstruct the outline of what happened. Enough to say their names when we have them. Enough to honor the unnamed when we do not. There is a video interview in the New York Public Library archives. It was recorded in 1989 as part of an oral history project about gay life before Stonewall. The interview is with a man named Louis Roth, no relation to Samuel Roth, the bookstore owner from earlier. Just another Louis. Louis Roth was 84 years old when the interview was recorded. He had gone to Stewart's in 1927. He was 22 at the time. He went regularly for 3 years. Then he met a man named Frank, and they moved in together, and he stopped going to the cafeterias because he did not need them anymore. Frank died in 1986. Louis and Frank had been together for 57 years. They had never married because they could not. They had lived as roommates officially. Lovers, actually. They had built a quiet life in a small apartment in Queens. They had jobs and friends and routines. They had each other. When Frank died, Louis was alone for the first time in nearly 6 decades. He did not know what to do with himself. Someone told him about the oral history project. He volunteered to be interviewed. He said he wanted to talk about Frank. He wanted someone to know. The interviewer asked Louis to describe how he met Frank. Louis said they met at Stewart's. He described the night in detail. It was March 1930. Cold. Frank was sitting alone at a table near the back. Louis had seen him there before, but never had the courage to approach. That night, Louis decided to risk it. He sat down across from Frank. Frank looked up. Louis said, "Mind if I join you?" Frank said, "I was hoping you would." Louis started crying during the interview. He was 84 years old, crying about a conversation that happened 59 years earlier. He said, "That was it. That was the moment my life started." The interviewer asked what they talked about that first night. Louis said he could not remember. Just small talk, probably. It did not matter. What mattered was the recognition, the understanding that they had both been waiting for this, that they had both been alone, and now they were not. Louis said they went to Stewart's together every week for the next 6 months. Then they found an apartment and moved in together. They told their families they were roommates sharing expenses. They told their landlords the same thing. Everyone believed it, or pretended to believe it. It did not matter which. Louis said, "We had 57 years. We got to wake up together almost every morning for 57 years. And it started in that cafeteria with 10-cent coffee and a rickety table and the courage to say hello." The interviewer asked if Louis had any message for young gay people watching this interview. Louis thought for a long time. Then he said, "It was harder for us, but we survived. And you will too. You will have things we never had. You will have rights we never imagined. But you will also have struggles we cannot predict. And when it gets hard, remember the men who sat in those cafeterias. Remember that we built something from nothing. Remember that you are standing on a foundation we poured with our lives." Louis Roth died in 1991. He was buried next to Frank. The graves say Louis Roth and Frank Meyer, beloved friends. The dates tell the story if you know how to read them. Born 6 years apart. died 5 years apart, together for 57 years in the middle. That was what the cafeterias made possible. Not just hookups or brief encounters, not just survival. They made love possible. Long-term committed love between men who were told that what they felt was not love at all, that it was sickness or sin or temporary insanity, that it could not last. Louis and Frank proved otherwise, as did hundreds of other couples who met in those rooms, who found each other over bad coffee and built lives that lasted decades, lives that were invisible to history until someone decided to look. If you go to the corner of 6th Avenue and Waverly Place today, there is nothing to mark where Stewart stood. The building is gone. In its place is a modern condo tower with a Starbucks on the ground floor. You can get your coffee there. It will be better than the coffee at Stewart's ever was. It will also cost 30 times as much and mean a fraction as much. The Starbucks is full every morning with people who have no idea what happened on that spot. They sit at small tables and look at their phones and drink their lattes, and they are living in a world those men at Stewart's helped build. A world where you can be openly gay and not lose everything. Where you can marry, where you can adopt children, where you can serve in the military and work in any profession, and live in any neighborhood, and not be fired or evicted or arrested just for existing. That world did not appear magically. It was built over decades by people who refused to disappear. People who sat in cafeterias and parks and bars and said, "We are here. You cannot make us leave. We will keep coming back." The men at Stewart's did not think of themselves as activists. They were not trying to change the world. They were just trying to survive. Trying to find a moment of connection in lives that were otherwise defined by isolation. Trying to have a cup of coffee with someone who understood. But their survival was resistance. Their visibility, however limited, was revolutionary. Every night they walked through that door, they were insisting on their right to exist, to gather, to see each other, to be seen. And someone did see them. The police saw them and harassed them. The neighbors saw them and complained. The journalists saw them and wrote vague, condescending articles. But other gay men also saw them. Young men who thought they were alone saw them and realized they were not. That made all the difference. There is no memorial to the cafeterias, no plaque, no monument, no historical marker. Most people walking past those corners today have no idea what they are walking past. The history is invisible, but invisibility has never stopped queer history before. We are used to being erased, used to having to dig for our own past, used to finding it in fragments and footnotes and archives that were never meant to preserve our stories. The cafeterias are in those archives now. George Chauncey put them there. Other historians have added to the record. The interviews and letters and diaries and photographs are preserved. They are accessible. Anyone who wants to know can find out. And more importantly, the story is being told. In books, in documentaries, in videos like this one. The men who sat at those tables are being remembered. Their names, when we have them, are being spoken out loud. Their lives are being honoured. That is what they wanted. Louis Roth said it explicitly. Sidney Lester implied it in his letter. Samuel Horowitz marked it with stars in his expense diary. They wanted to be remembered. They wanted someone to know that they had been there, that they had loved and lived and struggled and survived. So tonight we remember them. We say their names. Samuel Roth, Vincent Livelli, Eugene O'Neill, Arthur Monroe, Franklin Street, Morris Feinberg, Walter Koenig, Eddie Ramirez, Christopher Wells, Dorothy Myers, Sidney Lester, Louis Roth, and Frank Meyer, and the hundreds of others whose names we have. And we honour the thousands whose names we do not have. The men who sat alone at corner tables, the men who watched but never approached, the men who came once and never returned because the fear was too great, the men who were arrested and disappeared from the records, the men who took their own lives because the isolation was unbearable, the men who survived but never told anyone their story. They were there too. They mattered too. Their silence does not diminish their importance. It makes the voices we do have even more precious. The cafeterias closed. The buildings were torn down or repurposed. The people died. But what they built did not disappear. It transformed. It evolved. The cafeterias became the bars became the bathhouses became the community centres. Each generation of queer people builds on what came before, even when they do not know the history. You are part of that continuity. If you are queer and you have ever walked into a gay bar, or a pride parade, or a queer bookstore, or an online community, and felt that shock of recognition, that moment of realizing you are not alone, you are experiencing what those men at Stewart's experienced. The technology has changed. The legal landscape has changed. The culture has changed. But the fundamental human need for connection, for recognition, for community, that has not changed. The men at the cafeterias would not recognize the world we live in now. They would be amazed by marriage equality and anti-discrimination laws and corporate pride sponsorships. They would be baffled by dating apps and chosen pronouns and the endless proliferation of identity labels. But they would recognize the feeling, walking into a room and seeing people like you. The relief, the joy, the quiet certainty that you are going to be okay because you are not alone anymore. That feeling is the same now as it was in 1927, and that feeling is their legacy. Not the specific cafeterias, not the specific tables or the specific cups of coffee. The legacy is the knowledge that queer people have always found each other, always built community, always refused to be completely erased, always survived. When things get hard, and they will get hard because they always do, remember the cafeterias. Remember the men who had no legal protections, no cultural acceptance, no guarantee of safety, and who showed up anyway, who sat at those tables anyway, who built lives anyway. If they could do it then, you can do it now. You have more tools, more rights, more visibility, more support. You are standing on the foundation they poured. Use it, build on it, pass it along to the next generation so they can build even higher. That is how we honor them. Not with plaques or monuments, though those would be nice. We honor them by continuing what they started, by refusing to disappear, by insisting on our right to gather, to love, to exist, by telling their stories so the next generation knows they are part of something larger than themselves. So as you drift off tonight, think about a room full of men in 1927, drinking terrible coffee, wearing cheap suits, afraid but present, alone but together, building something that would outlast them all. Think about the courage it took to walk through that door the first time, to sit down at that table, to make eye contact with another man and risk everything for the possibility of connection. Think about the lives that started in those rooms, the friendships, the love affairs, the chosen families, the networks of care that kept people alive when the world wanted them dead. Think about Louis and Frank, together for 57 years because they said hello in a cafeteria in 1930. Think about the men whose names we will never know, but whose presence filled those rooms night after night after night. They were there. They survived. They mattered. And you matter too. Your story matters. The room you walk into tonight, whether it is a physical space or a digital one, whether it is obviously queer or quietly so, that room matters. You are continuing what they started. If this story stayed with you, the like button helps others find it too. May your dreams be free of police raids, morning headlines, and the weight of having to hide who you love. Good night and sleep well.